Hello and welcome back to Virtualize Everything. Today we're going to be continuing on with some more of our Nextcloud installation project. Just like we did in the previous video where we added a remote database, we're going to go one step further and we're going to add a remote storage solution to Nextcloud today. And I'm going to show you the process of how to actually create the Docker stack in order to do this and the steps that we're going to actually have to take in order to get Docker to work, or rather Nextcloud to work by default with this object-oriented storage database that we've chosen to use. And the whole point of this project, if you haven't picked up, is to actually create a high availability cluster for Nextcloud. So you're going to have a distributed set of database for storage and database for logins and other configuration storage, along with a distributed set of web servers. We won't get that far in this video. We're going to just look at what it takes to get the database working here with Nextcloud and what that looks like. So let's get on with this video. I've set up a container already. I do all of my Docker work in a container here in Proxmox, and that's what you're looking at. Now, this container has been updated and upgraded. It is an Ubuntu 24.04 instance that has had Docker and Docker Compose installed in it. So the first thing we're going to want to do here at the point of this container is actually to create our YAML file that's going to control our Docker stack. And we'll do that by entering a command of sudo nano and then docker-compose, and it's going to be a YML file because Docker Compose, of course, works with YAML files. So now that that's created, we're here inside of a text editor. As many of you probably already know what Nano looks like, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this stack in, and you can find all of these files just like you would normally on my website in the links here, but let's take and copy this in, and then we'll go ahead and talk about what is going on here. So scrolling up to the top, you can see that we've added a lot of different configurations here, and there's a lot more going on. So the first thing is our database, and this database we went over in the previous video, but we're going to touch on it a little bit more here. We've created our environment variables here for our database, and we've passed them in. And we've also set up our network as our Nextcloud network so that everything here communicates inside of one network and kind of just does everything. Now, the next part you see here is that object-oriented storage. So it's kind of a database storage client. It's called min.io. And what min.io does is it basically creates a Ceph or distributed type storage server where we actually store objects and call them with APIs. And that's going to need port 9000 and port 9001 opened, as well as a secret key and access key, which access key is your username and secret key is going to be your password. And that's going to allow us to actually log into the web interface and look at what's going on. Now, down here, our app itself, which is going to be Nextcloud. It looks pretty standard, but you can notice that we've added quite a bit to the environment. And I haven't gone and put a lot of this in our env file as of yet. We will need to change our host name to whatever IP address of this container is, and we'll need to come back and do that here in a minute. And you can notice that we're calling that port 9000 on to our database, and we've got SSL as false because we don't have that database using SSL. Now, this object stored database is going to work very similar to the Amazon S3 storage solution, and you'll see them used interchangeably in a lot of this actual installation as we go down the road. We're going to use our time zone and set our region, and our path style will be true. So the next step here, you can notice under volumes, we have a volume set up which points to a web server just like normal, but we've also added this other volume which is calling a script and an endpoint. Now for the initial startup of this, and this is partially, I've been working on it for 2 weeks, and I would love feedback if any of you see how to do this. I've tried to write a script that would actually go ahead and run once and identify that it ran once and not run again. But it also can't run the first time this boots because we need to allow Nextcloud to install. And if this script runs, Nextcloud won't install. It'll kind of just bind up. I've been unable to create that. And so my solution for this is I'm just going to comment these 2 lines out, and I'm going to do a few restarts through the whole entire process here, where I'm going to edit this configuration file to have Nextcloud behave the way I want it to do so. But what this script's going to do, and we'll show you the script here in a minute, is it's going to enable Nextcloud inside of the config.php file to use this object-oriented storage as default and not as like an external storage option. And that'll be important as we create the distributed installation and everything for high availability, because we want all of our data in one place by default right out of the box. You can also notice that I've set a depends on for both the database and the storage database, and I've created a separate storage volume for the storage database right here. Very similar to the one that I created for Nextcloud and the database in the previous video. And then finally, we end off by declaring the Nextcloud network. So now that we've discussed this file, we can go ahead and close this and save it. Now, as you know, I'm using DHCP here. That's probably not the best choice for an actual deployment of this, but it does make for the creation of these videos to be pretty easy. So I want to run an IPA and find out what my server is given for an IP address here. And we see that it's 192.168.0.6. So I'm just going to hop back to that YAML file and go ahead and change that host name line right now so that we know that it is 6 and not 7. And once more, we'll save it. All right. So now that we have our Docker file, we need to then create our environments file, just like we did in that previous video. And again, I'm doing a walkthrough kind of from the start of the setup here. I know we covered a lot of these steps, but so many of these files are changing in their contents. I thought it would be nice to go ahead and create a full video here of this, but I will continue to reference that video. So it may be a good idea to go back and watch it if you want a deeper understanding of some of these files. So what this env file is it's going to be an environment variable file. And that environment variable file, as I copy and paste here, is going to store, so inside of this env file, we're going to store a bunch of environment variables. And you can see here that I'm kind of using very generic type files here. I've not really put any information in. You want to make sure they're changing. From that previous video, again, we've added the information for our database of the secret access key and the secret key here. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and change these. You want to make sure you change these. And we've set our variable calls here so they will call outside of to all the different applications when they're configured once here. We will also set these so only your user account permissions later with a chmod 600 will be able to access file, and .env files are hidden by default. So let's go ahead and save this file. And the next thing we're going to want to create is that script that I talked about. And again, we'll be using Nano to create a text document for that script. And we're going to call that init underscore nextcloud.sh. Now, this file, I ended up using ChatGPT to help me with it. I am not very good at Bash here at all. And with that being said, I don't fully understand what's going on here to the depth that I really should. But we're here and we're going to try to look to see if a file has been created, and if that file has been created, we are going to execute this file. If it hasn't been created, we won't execute it. In turn, we also look and see if this environment block and these environments read from the actual configuration file for Docker for all of these different informations that fill in here. And that's why we put them in as environment variables inside of Docker. So it looks and sees if it's here and it doesn't execute it. Now, to my knowledge, that part actually does work right, but what doesn't work right is identifying this file and not executing if it isn't there. And what it'll do is it'll cause the installation just to hang up and nothing will work correctly. So my solution has been to comment the loading of this file out, do the installation, shut the whole process down, load it with this file, which will put in all of this information correctly. And then I've been doing it a third time because it really just doesn't need to run, and just closing it out. So that's kind of a hacky way to do it. If any of you have any advice on how to get this actually to work correctly, go ahead and drop it in the comments section. I'd love to learn from you. I probably just need to take some more time and learn Bash a little bit better, but in all of my projects plus my 40-hour a week job, I haven't found the time. With that, enough excuses. Let's continue moving on and save this file. The next thing we're going to need to do is set our actual file as executable because it's a script and we're going to want to execute that. And we're going to do that with a chmod plus x command for the file itself. And now we're going to get into a string of commands that are going to set permissions for files as well as create files that we're going to need for storage volumes. So the first one is going to be our sudo chmod 600.env, and this is going to set a chmod 600 for that env file, which, if you don't know, chmod 600 is going to be that only the user account and that is it. No group variables or nothing that created that env file has access to read or write from that file. So it's going to essentially make it that only the user of VE can work with that file, and that'll help us add a level of security to the env file. It's not the end all be all for a final deployment of installation like this. You really probably should use something like Docker Secrets if you're using a Docker Swarm or some other tool to manage that, but it is a good stepping stone for a development style setup, which is what we're doing here. So we'll go ahead and execute that. And now we'll go ahead and start making our files. So the first file is going to be the data store for the database. The next file will be the data store for Nextcloud, which will be needed as far as installing the application itself, but won't be used for storing any of the data anymore because we're going to pass that task off to Mini.io, which is our object-oriented storage database for this project. And then we will need to create the storage for that file as well. Now we're going to give admin read-write permission to these volumes for a chmod of 700. So what that's going to create is root user is going to have access to all of these files. And as you know, Docker runs by default as root user, and we haven't gone ahead and configured any of these containers to create a user outside of that root user environment at this time. So we're going to set all of these to the root user of 700, and we're going to do that for all three of the files that we just created. Now, with all three of those files that we just created done, the last thing we need to do is set a file that is created inside of our volume, which is going to actually store the Nextcloud data. And this is less important now, but it would be more important if we didn't have that database. But it's still there, and it's a good step to do. And we need to set that to the account that Nextcloud uses to communicate with that. And that's going to be www-data. So we're going to use chown to set ownership of that file and all files downstream from that. The next thing we want to do is make sure that our Docker Compose YAML file has been commented out. And I'm just using my up arrow to move up to our Docker Compose file, and I'm going to load it, and I'm going to come down here and make sure that it has been commented out, and it has. So we are good to go with this step. And I do this more as a verification for myself. It makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. So at this point, we can go ahead and start our Docker server or our Compose project. And since we're doing this all inside our home directory, I don't need to change. So we're starting this up, and you can notice I've dropped the -d, and that's just so that I get output logs and can see what's going on. Again, we're going to shut this down. We're going to run this script. We're going to do a couple other things in here, and we'll have opportunity to add that -d later so that this project will stay running. But right now we'll hit enter, and it'll go ahead and pull everything down from the server. It's going to take a little bit and get fired up, and I'll be back with you when we're ready to load into the web interface and start the installation process of Nextcloud. All right, so it looks like everything's downloaded and our database is started up, and you can see our Nextcloud app is also initializing and our database is running. So we can go ahead and create a new tab at this point, and we should be able to enter the IP address of this container, which, if you remember, was 192.168.6. And we passed that to port 8080. So we'll add a colon 8080 here, and this will get us started with Nextcloud. Now I've configured Nextcloud with no credentials or anything, so it does an install process here at this screen. So we can set up our admin variables as we choose. I'm going to use my simple username of VE and a really simple password here, and go ahead and hit install. Now this installation process will run for a little bit. As that's going, what we're going to do is we'll hop over to the admin interface of Mini.io here on 9001 and take a look at what's going on there. Now, I used a username of your access key and a password of your secret key. Of course, I showed that to you in the environment variable. I hope you change this on your setup and don't use these defaults. But I'm going to go ahead and enter them here, and I can log in, and you can kind of begin to see what's going on. Now, we haven't run any of that PHP or anything to create the buckets or anything like this, so it's pretty bland and vanilla as I click around here. Later on, I'll show you that some buckets are created, and the bucket is basically where your stuff gets stored from Nextcloud. It's kind of like your storage drive, but all of this stuff is object oriented, so it's kind of packaged inside of a container. I know I'm not really describing this well, but that's what happens. So we can install all this or not. I'm going to uncheck it. I did install it in the previous video when we looked around, but I'm just going to go ahead and skip through it so we can get with this video because it's not really the point of the video. Close it out and you can see that we have Nextcloud running and we're kind of able to interact with it just as we would normally. So with that, we can head back to Proxmox and we can actually now hit Control and C, which is going to shut down all of our containers. Remember, I told you we're going to have to do a couple of shutdowns of this. So once everything's shut down, we'll go ahead and we'll go back to our Docker Compose file here and scroll down, and we're going to uncomment those two lines. And that's going to run a script that's going to insert all of this information into that config.php file. And if you didn't want to do it with the script, you could remove these lines and manually edit all of that information into the config.php file. But I wanted to have a more automated way of doing that outside of the container to make it a little bit easier for the viewer to kind of copy and paste all the commands and run this as they were learning and not have to get in there. And these projects are all about learning, and getting into the nitty-gritty of the Docker container is probably beneficial. Sorry if I'm talking too much here, but I wanted an easier way to do it so you didn't have to learn those steps. So that's what I did. So anyways, with that, we're closing back out. We're saving the file, and we'll go ahead and start this up again with that -d dropped off. So we get the log and we can see everything starting up here. It's going to go, and we can see the Nextcloud app coming up. We'll kind of let everything boot up here for a moment and it should come up pretty quick. It actually looks like it's already up. And since we've already logged in and everything's created, we should just be able to hit refresh and come back alive, which we have. You can see we have all of our files, and any of those random files are gone because we've moved our primary storage of our Nextcloud here to that database. Now, if we hop over to the database and refresh, I found this database to log a little bit behind as far as updating like usage sizes and stuff. But what you can see here is there's 0 usage, which we expect because we haven't put anything on it. But we have now created a bucket that's called your bucket. And if you remember right from the configuration file, we had a line which was object store underscore bucket equals your bucket name, and we could have changed this to be a different name by editing that variable. I'll show you where that is in just a minute here, but what I do want to do is hop back here to Nextcloud so I don't have to come back and forth a bunch of times, and I want to hit new and I want to hit upload file, and I'm just going to grab a file off my system of some random image or something that I have here from a previous video, and I'm going to go ahead and upload it, and we'll pull it up and you can see that it comes in and that it's 229 kilobytes. Now, what'll happen here is, like I said, it doesn't come in automatically, but if I hit refresh a few times, you can see that our size in kilobytes will go up. And I have found that there's a few minutes of delay here, usually seeing it. See, it's gone up again, but there's actually some data here, and we've created 6 object ties here for this database for the size that it has. So we did indeed store a file from Nextcloud inside of our database with or our object-oriented storage database with an external user database here on Nextcloud. But as I told you, there was one last step here. And what we'll want to do for that is go ahead and again hit Control C, close this all down, open our compose file, come down here. Right here is the line where you could change the name of that bucket or that storage container for Nextcloud if you wanted to. But we're coming all the way down here, and we're just going to remove this endpoint line and the script line so it doesn't run again, continuously putting this information inside of the config PHP file, taking up storage and making the possibility of things not run right later on down the road. And we'll save this, exit it, and finally start this container and everything up by adding the -d, which will hide everything and get it up and running. This time we get no log outputs, and we can run docker ps and see that all 3 containers are up and running. Coming back over to Nextcloud, we can refresh. You see our file that was created here of this thumbnail that ChatGPT was used to create. And you can see our database, if we refresh, is running and the size has all stayed the same. And you can move around and everything works inside of Nextcloud. So there you have it. Here's the next step in our journey towards high availability Nextcloud, where we've added a object-oriented storage database, similar but different to Ceph. Ceph doesn't work in a API triggered object-oriented type way. It works more as a drive, but it's very similar in basic concepts, let's say, and I'm very oversimplifying that. Don't crucify me in the comments. But we've added that to Nextcloud, and our next journey will be to create some multiple instances and tie these databases together in a way that they work as a distributed cluster. Now, I got a few videos I want to do in between this point, so you'll have to hold with me for that video coming out, but it will come out in a few weeks here. So with that, I'm going to conclude this video. I hope you enjoyed adding the object storage to Nextcloud and the journey we're on here with this project, and you'd consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to help Virtualize Everything continue to grow and bring you more content like this around the virtualization world. As always, have a good night.